On a March night in the Everglades, a researcher waded in and lifted a juvenile reptile out of the shallows with his bare hands. He held it for a photograph, then clipped a small piece of its tail and sealed it in a vial of white powder for the lab. That sample sat for 2 years. When the result came back, it said the animal shared its bloodline with populations in South Africa, not with anything kept in a Florida exhibit. Florida's spotlight crews had been scanning for the wrong predator. Rafael Crespo stood there in the shallows, holding that animal across his forearms, feeling the weight of it shift and resist, and had no idea what he was actually holding. He clipped the tail, packed the scutes into dryerite, the dry, chalky preservative that keeps DNA intact, and sent them north to a lab. Then the swamp closed over the moment and forgot it. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch, and this is the story of how 4 crocodiles slipped into Florida's waterways over 14 years and left behind a question nobody in wildlife management has yet answered. To understand why that result from the lab changed everything, you have to understand the world Florida thought it already knew. Florida has 2 crocodilians, the American alligator, heavy-bodied and black with a broad rounded snout, and the American crocodile, lighter, narrower-jawed and rare enough that spotting one is still a small event. Neither one hunts humans as prey. Floridians who live along the canals know this, and after decades of coexistence, they have learned to read the water the way a driver reads traffic. But the Nile crocodile, olive-backed, yellow-bellied, armoured across every inch, is a different proposition entirely. Across sub-Saharan Africa, it reigns as an apex predator that treats large mammals, including people, as a routine food source, and a full-grown adult can reach 18 feet. It lies submerged until only its eyes and nostrils break the surface, then bursts from the water and drags its prey under. It can sprint on land, it can cross territory on foot, and, as Florida was about to learn, it can navigate a man-made canal like a road. So when Kenneth Crisco and his team at the University of Florida finally ran the DNA from those preserved tail scutes in 2016, the results stopped the room. The genetics matched wild populations in South Africa, not a single Florida exhibit, not one captive animal. And the animals were thriving here, growing at 40.5 centimeters per year, 28% faster than juveniles from their native African range, fed by Florida's warm water and abundant prey. All those years, the state's attention and its budget was aimed at a snake. What had actually arrived was older, more dangerous, and far more comfortable around people's backyards, and it had been learning the canal system from the inside. The question the lab result left behind was not how the Nile crocodile got here, it was how many were still out there, and the record on that question was thin. 4 animals recovered across 14 years from a canal system that stretches across 2 counties and connects directly to the Everglades, a wilderness so vast that no one has ever fully mapped what lives inside it. The chain of attempts stretched back to 2000, and each one was smaller than the problem it was trying to solve. That first juvenile, pulled from a Miami-Dade canal, triggered no broad survey, no DNA sweep, no coordinated response. Then 2009, another capture, another animal secured, and still no molecular analysis to confirm what agency managers were actually dealing with. The institution preferred the simpler explanation: escaped exotic pets, a local nuisance, probably contained. And Florida had earned that reflex. Over the years, its canals have given up spectacled caimans, dwarf caimans, even a slender, snouted crocodile from West Africa, one-off escapees collected and filed away. Another loose pet was not laziness, it was pattern recognition. The pattern just happened to be wrong this time. It was also cheaper to believe. A full DNA program costs money and requires university partnerships nobody had asked for. But the ordinary witnesses were already right. The residents calling in reports of unusual reptiles and bigger than any caiman, wrong color for a gator, moving wrong, were describing an animal that the captures kept proving right, one animal at a time. The 2012 animal was caught, measured snout to vent, sexed by hand, tail notched, and then released to track its movements. A decision that looks cautious on paper and looks like an error in hindsight, because that animal then travelled 29 kilometres through the canal grid with no one following. So here is what those 4 captures, across those 14 years, actually measured. 1 animal removed in 2000, 1 secured in 2009, 1 tracked through the residential waterway grid in 2012, and 1 juvenile lifted by hand from Everglades National Park in 2014. Each one a data point, none of them a solution. The genetics that came back in 2016 ruled out Florida's captive population entirely. Every zoo, every attraction, every licensed facility whose animals might have slipped loose. The rule of inference is simple. If the DNA doesn't match what's in a cage, it came from somewhere wild. And wild South African Nile crocodiles do not migrate to Florida. Someone moved them, and nobody has ever counted the shipments. Kenneth Crisco put it plainly, the odds that the few people who study Florida reptiles found all of them is probably unlikely. That is a scientist saying the survey was not the population. It was a sample, and a small one. What those 14 years came to mean is this. Florida identified a problem in pieces and confirmed it decades late. The crocodile is still in the water, and the count is still at 4. The canals. Nobody checked. The count stopped at 4, but the canal system didn't stop at the capture sites. South of where every animal was taken, the waterways branch and widen into a grid that no survey team has ever walked end to end. And this is where the problem shifts from what was found to what was never looked for. Here is how the found ones were found. Field crews responded to calls from private citizens, then went out at night, running spotlight surveys from boats, sweeping the beam along the banks until it came back off a pair of reptilian eyes. Then harpoons and nets, and a thrashing juvenile corralled into a narrow section of man-made canal. It works. 4 times, it worked. But look at what the method requires. An animal in plain view of a boat, in an accessible channel, close enough to a neighbourhood that somebody noticed it in the first place. The deeper system offers none of that. It offers sawgrass that closes behind you, channels that branch without signage, and water so dark that a juvenile can hold perfectly still and vanish at arm's length. Every capture in this story happened where people were looking. Nobody has funded the version of this search that goes where people are not. And it is not that Florida won't spend money on an invasive species. In 2025, the state put $2 million into a single season of python removal and pulled 1,022 snakes out of the Everglades in 3 months. That is what the search looks like when Florida decides something matters. The crocodile's version of that search has never happened. And the water being searched is not remote wilderness. That is what makes this story different. The canals run through neighbourhoods, behind yards, alongside jogging paths, under the same bridges where residents walk their dogs at dusk. An animal that entered this grid as a juvenile has had more than a decade to learn it. Every branch, every culvert, every quiet bank where the beam of a survey boat never reaches. What the 4 captured animals settled was the species. What they left unsettled was the scale. And until someone takes the search into the deeper grid, the water simply keeps its answer. The death roll is the thing most people picture wrong. It is not a frantic thrash. It is a single deliberate torque of the whole body on one axis, the jaws locked, the animal spinning its own weight against whatever it has clamped, tearing rather than pulling. A Nile crocodile at full maturity closes its jaw the way a hydraulic press closes. Slow, absolute, and with no release until the animal decides to let go. Florida has watched its alligators make a version of that move for a century, and learned to live beside it. But the alligator learned that move on turtles and fish. The Nile crocodile learned it on wildebeest, cattle, and people crossing rivers. That curriculum is what an animal carries into a new habitat, not just its body, but the prey it was built to read. And Florida's waterways are full of large mammals at the shoreline every evening, at exactly the distance this predator is trained by evolution to close. But the behavior is only half the problem. The other half is camouflage, and not the kind most people expect. Start with what this animal does to stay hidden. It swallows stones, gastroliths, dead weight carried in the gut that helps it regulate its buoyancy so it can hang in the water without a ripple. A Nile crocodile lying motionless in the shallows, nothing showing but 2 eyes and the low ridge of a dark back, does not look wrong in a Florida canal. It looks exactly like what Floridians have been trained for decades to ignore, a local minding its business in the shallows. An alligator you leave alone will almost always leave you alone. A Nile crocodile you leave alone is an ambush that has not happened yet. That is the specific danger the count of 4 never captured. Not the animal's size, but its invisibility inside a familiar picture. And so, the Nile crocodile in Florida occupies a position no other invasive species here does. Confirmed real, confirmed thriving, confirmed capable of killing a person, and confirmed unresolved. The species is confirmed. The count never was. Florida built its canal system to drain a swamp and found out it had built a highway, and the most dangerous animal ever to use it arrived without an announcement. Right now, somewhere in that black water, a pair of eyes is sitting just above the surface, reading the bank. Breeding population or final 4, which one is Florida living with? Tell us in the comments.